It's been my experience over the 42 years of ministry, most Christmas Eve, Christmas evening services usually ends up with the pastor waxing poetically retelling the Christmas story in his own words, or she gives a theological treatise of the Incarnation that will have you asleep and screaming in the next 15 minutes. I'm not going to do either. I am going to retell a story I have told before, and if you have heard this before, I apologize. But we've been through a terrible year. A year with so many divides, and so many things that have divided us. By race, by political philosophy, by religious tradition. So I want to share a story. I want to tell you a true story. And it is something that happened to me 35 years ago tonight. It was Christmas Eve, 1982. No, I did not meet a young pregnant couple going to Jerusalem. All right, none of that. And as I've told people before, I'm not being snarky, I'm just telling you the truth. I have spent too many years working in the bishop's office. I have never been visited by 3 wise men at the same time. The second year being sent to study canon law. It's a very intense year, and it's a year that I did not have time to go home during Christmas break. And the reason for that was that the break itself was so short. And in those days, you couldn't get a direct flight from Ottawa to New York. You had to go Ottawa, Montreal, New York, Ottawa, Toronto, New York, Ottawa, Denver, New York. Those were the only flights. And it would take longer to get home than the Christmas break we would have had. And I knew I was studying for comprehensive exams in April, so most of us who were in our final year just stayed, while school had closed. And I was helping out. I was a priest. I'd been a priest for 5 years. I was helping out in a parish in Corkery, Ontario, which is right at the absolute outskirts of the Diocese of Ottawa. As a matter of fact, if you went 15 feet beyond the church where I was going, you actually were entering another ecclesiastical diocese of Hamilton, Ontario. Okay? I became friends with the young pastor, and he had said, would I be willing to celebrate Midnight Mass in his mission church, which was in Pakenham, Ontario, 25 miles further out. So it took 45 minutes to get to Corkery, another 25 miles to get to Pakenham. And he also said, it's Christmas Eve, why don't you come out and you can spend the evening here, but I'm going out to dinner with parishioners, so whatever's in the fridge you can have for dinner. So I brought my books with me, because I knew I'd get some time for study. And in the refrigerator, 5 slices of Kraft American cheese and a half a tin of tuna. And this was going to be Christmas meal. Needless to say, I was not in the best of spirits. Okay? I studied till about 10:30, and I figured it's going to take me a good hour to get out. These are windy country roads. It's pitch black, a lot of farmland once you leave the area. And the roads are so windy, countrified, and scary, it makes like the roads in South Salem look like Broadway by comparison. So I gave myself plenty of time. I walk out of the residence. I looked at the thermometer. It was 35 below, which is, Ottawa gets very cold winters. And, what we call awful weather, they call July. Okay? I get in the car, and just as I'm starting to head out to Pakenham, I notice it's starting to snow. I don't want to see snow. I don't want to be there in the first place. I don't want to go out to the little mission church, and I don't want to drive on these country roads that wind and curve and everything in Canadian snow and ice. So I made the trip, and this is one of those moments that if I could have been in a one-horse open sleigh, I really would have appreciated it. It would have been safer and easier to travel that way. As I get to the hill, approaching Pakenham, I noticed the lights of the whole village, and it was a Hallmark card type of village. It was cute, I guess. And I noticed the lights were twinkling. Now you think that's romantic. You think that's sweet. That means the lights were flickering. It means the storm cut the power. And as I slid into what became my parking space, the final resting place of my car, and that's where it stayed in the midst of the snow and in the midst of the ice, the town was without power. Now, I've preached about this in other places. You in South Salem know what it's like to lose power, okay? So I walked into St. Peter's, and there were people waiting for me there, and they said, well, what do we do? And I said, well, I'm here, and I can't get back. It's a church. Get some candles. We have candles. I said, let's get as many candles as we can. If any of you have gas space heaters in your homes, this would be a good time to bring them. And we'll find a space we can work in, and we'll do the best we can. We won't have any organ music because we had no power, but we'll sing. And we'll celebrate this liturgy as best we can. And as I'm trying to organize, because I have this need in me to try to organize things, a knock on the door, and a group of people were at the door. And I noticed from the body language of the people I was talking to that this was a problem. And I turned around, and it was people from, now you have to get this in your head, diagonally 2 blocks over was a French church. This French church technically was across the diocesan boundary, but it was across a cultural boundary, because French and English parishes have nothing to do with each other. At least they didn't 35 years ago, in my experience of Canada. As a matter of fact, these two churches had had nothing to do with each other since what we call the French and Indian War. All right? And they asked me, very nicely, would I be willing to go and celebrate midnight Mass for them in French after I celebrated the Mass in English for this church, because their priest couldn't make it out because the roads were too dangerous. And it's like, now you're telling me? I looked at them and I said, look, my French is limited to this phrase, s'il vous plaît. I know nothing else. I can't preach in French. I can't celebrate in French. And they said, well, what will we do? We have to have Mass. And I finally, I guess maybe because I was so young, I was just tired enough and scared enough and cold enough and wet enough and angry enough to say, enough! No more. We're not going to do this divided, at least not tonight. Now, I'm not going to tell you this was the Christmas truce of 1914 where they sang Silent Night in the 2 bunkers. But culturally, and it's not for me to judge the people of French and English-speaking Canada, but for them, this was a huge divide. I said, look, go back to the church, get your candles, bring your hymnals, and while you're at it, bring a shovel, because we're going to have to shovel our way out of here. And I said, come back here, and we'll just pick the largest room we can find, set up as much as we can, and we will celebrate Eucharist, and we will celebrate Christmas together as one parish. At least for one night, we're going to put an end to the stupidity of human arrogance and our mutual distrust and hatred of each other. And we did. And I'm not going to tell you it was romantic and perfect. It wasn't. I mean, we sang carols in English and carols in French, and I enjoyed it, and mostly we were off-key. We had acolytes from both churches kind of walking around half in the dark, and it was kind of like, if you kind of remember, if you're old enough to remember the beginning of video games that would pinball off each other, that's what the kids were like. We used the other kids. They made up a Christmas pageant and a Christmas tabloid, and we used kids from both parishes, and we did with what we had. I'll never forget, we had Mary and 2 Josephs, but we used everyone. But in all of that, I learned something that night. And I share this with you, given all of the division and the anger and the stupidity, which is humankind of 2017. I learned this lesson, and this was the gift given to me. I learned that when you want to follow Christ, you're going to have to travel. And Jesus brings you from the place where you're at to the place where he wants you to be. And you have to be open to that. That Christ brings people together no matter who they are, where they come from, or what their background is, whether they are teenagers or old elders, whether they are children or adults. And that Christmas is not about what you do for each other. It is not even about what we do for God. It is about what God has done for us. That's what this is about. This is about his redeeming grace that we sing about in the carol. As churches, we're stronger together than separated. And it doesn't make any difference whether the sermon is pretty or poetic or structurally proper or theologically not heretical. But what I learned that evening is that no physical limitation no age disparity, no weather issues, no issues of poverty or nationality or language or culture or ethnicity or racial divides, no human anger or hatred or small-mindedness or the scars of history and memory. None of that can stand before the love of Christ in the world if you will be the candle in the darkness when you sing Silent Night and be a witness of his love in the world. That changes the world. All of the plans and all of the strategies we have mean nothing if we can't live the good news and spread the good news, because Jesus came among us to be the good news. What Christmas is about is letting Christ be the center and mover of your life. So be empowered by his redeeming grace. And when you walk out of this church, when you walk back into your life, I ask you this: a little bit more, to love like Christ, to give like Christ, to forgive like Christ, and to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God, and be Christ's light in a broken world. And thus, for me, is what I hope you take home with you. Amen.
Amen.